We are back. I'm JR again. I'm with Dr. Robert again. Hi, Dr. Robert. How are you?
I'm okay. Hi, JR.
We are this time going to go into a bit of a deep dive on your first solo album. I'd love to say from 1996, or I could possibly say from 1994. That's a conversation we'll get into in a minute, I guess. Realms of Gold. I mean, we could potentially just go through the tracks and I could ask you, where does that come from? What's that about? But I think it's probably better to get a little bit of context for the album before we go in, and to talk more generally about the making of the album before we talk necessarily about the specifics of it. Mm-hmm. Because it being your first solo album and its UK release being in 1996, that puts it 5.5 years after the last Blow Monkeys album. And so I want to discuss just a little bit what kind of a place you were in at the time when you came to record this. Because you didn't record it as late as 1996. The recording started as early as maybe 1991. Some of the B-sides are 1991 versions of tracks that ended up on the album. I've got two big questions I want to ask as part of this sort of introduction to the idea of the album. One of which I'll save for a minute. But the other one is this. You've got the demo version of Realms of Gold, which is a lot sort of maybe a bit more calypso, a bit more sort of Latin than the version that ends up on the final album. In fact, the final album's got a very sort of North American feel, but you've also got the version of Sanctuary that turns up on the B side of Pond Life, which again is a lot more sort of calypso stroke Latin. And you've got the two singles that preceded it by a few years, I've Learned to Live with Love and A Simpler Place and Time, which also both had a kind of calypso-y, Latin-y feel. Was there a point at which this album might have been a sort of much more calypso stroke Latin America sort of themed album before you changed direction on it? Or was that direction change before you'd even decided to sort of do a solo album, do you think?
I don't think I ever intended to do anything to do with calypso, to be honest.
There's kind of... There is a sort of theme of that, though, in a couple of those songs, isn't there?
I know what you're saying, yeah. I mean, it's a bit of a hazy period, but when the band broke up, 1990 end of, or beginning of 91, somewhere around there, I was still living in London, and I signed I had about a 6-month period where I was talking to record companies, and I signed to EMI as a solo artist. And I got, I signed to Regal Zonophone, in fact. I got Regal Zonophone going again. And they gave me a bit of a budget to make an album, even though it was only a singles deal. So that's what I did. I made an album. So that version of Realms of Gold that you hear was actually recorded in Abbey Road Studio 2, the Beatles one, with an 18-piece orchestra. It was really called the demo version as a joke because it cost a fortune. Yeah. And I went to New York to work with Axl Cole again on Simpler Place and Time, and I Learned to Live with Love was the first single. So I was building a collection of songs really towards an album. And I kept going in and recording more things. So that ended up as B-sides, or Lucifer's Friend was one version of Sanctuary. I had all sorts of things going on. But then the guy that signed me to EMI left. And I was pretty high and dry there. I had no support within the company. I think Freddie Mercury might have died, and they were sort of putting all their resources into that, and Cliff Richard had a new record coming out, and I was way down the bottom of that. Mm-hmm. So they put the two singles out, but they forgot that I had recorded this album, or at least I hope they had, because over the next few years I used some of those tracks, probably, I don't know, when I was allowed to, but I did, and they appeared. And then in the meantime, I formed this other kind of little band with a drummer called Starjuice. He was the drummer from, he was in the Wooden Tops, Benny Staples. He was in New Zealand, a fantastic drummer, really individual. And he played a kind of techno style with a drum machine. And I played a sort of distorted acoustic guitar. And we did quite a few gigs together. We supported Paul Weller on a few things. But people were kind of not sure what it was. It was kind of electro funk, you know? Yeah. And I was quite into it. I did again, I wrote song. I was finding that place for the songs like Catch Away and things like that I'd done, trying to make this crossover thing, but finding it hard to get a deal, and time was going on, and I was getting a bit like, well, hang on, this is getting, like you said, this is getting a bit later than I started writing all the songs that ended up on Lambs of Gold, basically, but they were in a different form.
Yeah.
Because Benny then left suddenly and went back to New Zealand, just as we had been offered a deal by a Japanese company called Pony Canyon, who had signed Paul Weller as well. And so I had this deal, and this must have been 92 or 93.
Yeah.
To make an album from this Japanese company, Pony Canyon. So I had the songs, I was ready to go. I was going to make a very different album with Benny as Starjuice, but in the end I just did it as Dr. Robert. Called up my friends, booked a studio in Leamington Spa, which was near where I was living because I'd moved out of London by then, and recorded this album with a bunch of friends, basically.
So, yeah, okay. So I've got some more general questions to ask concerning that, I guess. You say you booked a studio and you went in with a bunch of friends to record it. So that sort of leads to several questions. I guess the first one of which is, did you go in with a kind of a bunch of songs that you knew you were doing and you had a sort of set plan of what the album was going to consist of?
I because I was frustrated and a bit keen to get something done. I was, I wanted to, because I wasn't used to not putting stuff out. A lot of things had happened in my life, the whole Blow Monkeys thing ends, suddenly the people that you thought were on your side, they're not answering calls, the cars stop coming, things start coming in the post, things changed a lot for me in those years. I had a young family, very young kids, moved out of London, a lot of financial shit going on, too much drinking, the whole changing from sort of late 20s into early 30s, but always writing and always trying to find out where I could fit in now, whether I could carry on or not, really, because things had changed so much, and we were now into sort of like having one of these Stone Roses, beginning of Britpop was coming around the corner, blah, blah, blah. I moved out of London into this kind of little hunting lodge in this village called Newbuckle, which only had one kind of big kind of pad and its little hunting lodge at the bottom. We rented the hunting lodge. I lived in Brixton, right? So I woke up one morning, looked out the window, and there's a fox hunt going through our garden. It was like being in a Bruegel painting. I just thought, what the fuck? Where am I? What's going on here? Because I was, a few years before that, I'd open the window and see the riots in Brixton, which I much preferred, So anyway, things had changed for me. And I went in with the idea that, right, I'm going to record as live as possible with a few friends that I really know and trust playing instruments. Mick Talbot, Alan White on drums, Gil Kang, Marco playing bass, Weller came along and joined in, which was great because so I was living up the road and struggling. And I thought I'd go into the studio and we won't use any EQ, we won't use any reverb, we'll make something that is just like flat and honest.
Natural sort of sound.
Natural, because it will be timeless. And I'm going to sing live while we do these takes. I'm going to build it around the performance.
Right.
I'm not going to spend hours building up something like I did in the 80s with big productions and all that. I didn't have the budget. I didn't have the will. I didn't want to do that. I had gone through a massive shift in the way that I was listening to music. I kind of re-engaged. If you think about the last Blow Monkeys album, Springtime for the World, that was pretty much me sitting at a computer, very early days, making dance music, trying to make something about world music crossed with all sorts of things, just trying to experiment and have fun. But I picked up the acoustic guitar again. I'd really gotten into words again, wanting to write, listening to an awful lot of like Greenwich Village stalwarts, Fred Neil in particular. I'd gone, started going to places like the Heavenly Social and people like Jeff Barrett there and introduced me to that kind of thing. Obviously Dylan and everything that leads you back.
The Drake, I'd imagine.
Nick Drake, of course, yeah. Early Nick Drake. Well, it's all early Nick Drake.
Yeah.
But also, I mean, actually, I like Pink Moon is my favourite. But kind of where I'd come from in a way, because I was a massive Donovan, Tyrannosaurus Rex, and all that stuff. I loved all that, So I wanted to get back to that, and
well, that's it. During the sort of latter stages of when you were in the Blow Monkeys, you had like an album pretty much every year for 5 years. And each one was a massive, pretty much each one was a massive evolution from the one that came before, such that if you listen to any two of those albums back to back, you can barely tell they're the same band. And this really feels like back to basics. And you did go into the studio thinking, let's go back to basics. Let's strip it all back. Let's get back to the music, in other words, where you'd come from, rather than the sort of those sort of outside ideas, those technical ideas that come from outside music, I suppose.
I had no expectations. I had no pressure from a company. All that had disappeared very quickly. The whole mechanism, and so there was no expectation of this being, a success. Even it had to be good. It had to just be my first solo record. It had to come from a place that was real for me. There was no. So I wanted the sound of the record to reflect that as well, and also reflect what I had gotten into. There's a thing called the Harry Smith Folk Anthology, which is like a sort of Alan Lomax type archaeological kind of field recording thing, going back to the history. I felt like after the Blow Monkeys, I needed to re-educate myself or educate myself, because I was kind of making it up as I went along in the Blow Monkeys, and there's a chance of that. But I didn't really have any roots in terms of music. I had grown up listening to Scottish folk songs with my mum and my sister as well, and there was a connection with that kind of music, but I hadn't explored it in my writing. And also the kind of biographical nature of some of the lyrics, things like it started to come through. And the honesty, I wanted just to, and at the same time, because I'd moved up to this place in Oxfordshire, my friend Paul Weller was recording in the Manor, and he was, I think, doing his first album, and he might have started Wildwood, and I was sort of helping him there, kind of going in, playing a bit of guitar, a bit of bass, just hanging. And so he reciprocated and came and played on the record too. So there were all sorts of elements of us at that point in our lives mixing up influences and listening. Like he introduced me to some things like Tim Hardin things, and I sort of gave him Nick Drake, and we were swapping things and learning from each other during that period, I think. Well, you should when you're into music,
Well, absolutely, you do. That's what you do with friends. You all pass albums around and everybody gets into new stuff. Speaking of friends, so the personnel on this album, they're not Blow Monkeys personnel. These are people who presumably you hadn't actually worked with before, or if you had worked with them, you'd worked with them, I suppose, in small doses on some of the stuff. Because this sort of 3 or 4 year period between between Springtime for the World and recording this, I guess, you hadn't been slack. You'd been recording lots of stuff, as you mentioned before. I guess these are sort of people you picked up during that period. Is that fair to say?
No, I think I knew Marco from way back, like, because he was involved in kind of later Blow Monkeys things like Slaves No More. And he was during that kind of period when we were doing a bit of house music and stuff. Marco was always around. Obviously, I knew Mick Talbot because I'd met him back at the Red Wedge gigs, and Mick had played on Springtime for the World. So,
yes, of course, yeah.
There were people, that we just sit and play as well sometimes, just jam and stuff. And friends like Rhoda Dakar coming in and singing. And, it didn't feel, it felt like I just had good friends around, really, to sort of to relax with and jam with, and say, I'd show them the song in the morning, we go and record it. And and I was doing live vocals on them at that point. I'd started playing gigs, solo acoustic gigs.
Yeah.
I started off at this little club in Harlesden, Mean Fiddler Acoustic Room, which was quite intimidating because it was packed and very small. and they were my first solo gigs with just an acoustic guitar and a bottle of wine. And I think people were expecting me not to be able to play. I think there was an element of people that watched the Blow Monkeys that thought I was just a guy with a fringe posing at the front.
Yeah.
And so I had a lot of, and that was partly my fault for the way that we were marketed, and I allowed that to happen to a point, although it wasn't always within my control. So I had, coming and playing just acoustic guitar, being naked like that on stage. It was also a factor in leading me to this place where I recorded an album like this.
Yeah, sure. In fact, my partner, who wasn't a Blow Monkeys fan and only knew like the hits, when I, obviously I've been playing a lot of your solo stuff and later stuff, and she has said, "Oh, he's actually really underrated as a songwriter," because all she knew was like digging your scene. It doesn't have to be this way. She only knew the package. She didn't hear the songwriting underneath. Do you know what I mean? And this is the album that brings that out.
Yeah, maybe. I think so. For a long time, I couldn't listen to those Blow Monkeys records because I could hear the naivety in the writing. I could hear the desperation in my singing. I could hear this and that and that. But now I've come right out the other side, and I'm okay with that guy now. I quite like it. I can see. Sure. I can see there's something in there. I was always trying to make forever changes by love.
Right.
I was always thinking that's the blueprint, man. That big, which actually we got quite close to on this last album. Sort of 40 years later. But yeah.
It's Bacharach and David meets love, right?
Yeah, but at this period when we're talking about now, it was very much strip it all away.
Shall I tell you something? I'll tell you something about where I sort of was coming from. And I don't know what you'll make of this, but my favourite songwriter up to this point had been Paul Simon, and particularly the stuff he did with Art Garfunkel. And I was always a massive, massive fan, because the thing that I like most about music is counterpoint melodies. And the thing that I sort of most like about the presentation of music is something that I'm going to call counterpoint genre. And the thing that I liked about Paul Simon is he took folk and he took rock and he married the two together. And so obviously did people like Dylan, and even, Nick Drake is not strict folk. It's folk, but with an influence of rock or pop or whatever. But the thing I particularly liked about Simon and Garfunkel is they took folk and they took rock, and then they added a whole lot of other influences on top. So you've got sometimes big string ballads, sometimes big piano-led songs. Sometimes you've got things with a Latin American feel again. And I liked the variety, but the variety wedded to this sort of basic root in the music around which all the influences were swirling. And I think Realms of Gold is the point at which that happens to you in your career, because Limping for a Generation is very obviously sort of influenced by that sort of, they called it jazz punk, didn't they? I don't know if at the time, but since it's become described as a sort of jazz punk record. But you can also feel a slight folk influence in there. But you can feel the sort of root of the influence in there. And I think in the last two Blow Monkeys albums, you can't really hear where the root of the influence comes from in that way anymore. And I think this is the bit where you sort of redefine yourself in a way that moving forwards, you can always hear after this. So I think this is the point at which you become sort of Robert Howard, the songwriter, as opposed to Robert Howard, the apparently I'm running out of time on our call. I don't know if that's actually going to stop or not. If it does, I'll do something about it. As opposed to Robert Howard, the sort of presentation that was sort of like almost a record company construct at points during the Blow Monkeys. For what it's worth, I think Realms of Gold, because it takes what I liked about Simon and Garfunkel and does it in a really contemporary and really sort of natural and organic and really accessible way, a way that feels really human. I would say that Realms of Gold is probably my favourite album of all time. So let's dig into the songs a bit. The opening track on the UK version, I think it's the opening track on the original Japanese version as well, because there are a few changes there. We'll get into that, I suppose, later on. Realms of Gold, the title track, that's a bit of an outlier from the rest of the album. Did it feel like an outlier when you were putting the album together? I think that feels a bit distinct from the rest of the album. It's got this sort of gospel-y blues sort of sound. It still has a bit of the folkish sort of sound that comes in more frequently during the rest of the album. But it just, to me, it feels like a slight outlier that kind of almost sets the listener's mind to thinking you're going to be taken in one direction before the album does a big sharp left turn after that and takes you somewhere else instead. How much do you think about the sequencing of the tracks on an album? Was it a deliberate choice to put that one first? And did you realise at the time, do you realise now, or am I sort of barking up the wrong tree, that that one's a bit of a red herring for where the rest of the album's going to be? And I say that as a huge caveat because I'm about to say it's not a red herring at all, but I'll come to that when I ask you about the next song. But Realms of Gold, how does that song feel and fit for you, I guess is what I'm asking.
Well, let me see. There's a lot to answer there, JR.
Yeah, sorry.
That was a hell of a question. What was the question again? Okay. Sure. I mean, I always liked red herrings, put it that way. You know, so I like albums that start off. There's a classic example, all the tired horses in the sun. How are we going to get any riding done? It's the first track on Self-Portrait by Bob Dylan, and it's just sung by some session singers, some girls.
Right.
It sounds like the Swingle Singers almost, but it's nothing to do with anything that Dylan's ever done before or since, and especially nothing to do with that album. But it's a genius start to an album, and I wasn't thinking of that, but I hadn't seen it in that way. But I do like the idea of red herring starters. Realms of Gold was just lyrically, it was the cool. It comes from a John Keats poem. Keats was the one kind of romantic poet that I really related to, because I had a great English teacher who opened up that world for me. What was previously a distant academic world that I didn't really understand, and made it real. So much of I travelled in the Realms of Gold is from a Keats poem. The Realms of Gold being the imagination, and so it's an attempt to. It's a cry for sort of not help, but it's like a war cry. It's a cry of intent, the whole lyric. So I used to love doing it live. I still do sometimes, because I'd almost do it without playing the guitar. I could almost just sing the lyric. So it was something very. It was a message of intent to start the record with. Here I am. I'm doing this now. This is me. And now this is me. Sounds like Mike Yarwood, And so, of course, they're all me. They're that's the joke, really. You think it's, we're getting into the idea of authenticity, because I in some ways I think Liberace is as authentic as the Sleaford Mods. I don't buy into the idea of authenticity, but in a sense, it was me coming clean and saying, this is who I am, this is what I believe in, and this is what you're going to hear.
Yeah. Well, and I said it's a bit of a red herring, but at the same time, it's not, because I think Realms of Gold, I think musically, it sounds slightly different from what follows, in that there's a big sort of American influence, I guess, across basically the whole album, I suppose. But on this one, it's a slightly different, it's kind of got this sort of slightly gospel-y sound, which I don't think you quite get in the rest of the album. The rest of the album leans a bit more towards country at times and folk, obviously. But at the same time, as you say, it sort of lays down this idea that, and so here's my second big question, which, and obviously when I say it's a big question, I'm sort of slightly having a bit of fun. Because I think the whole album feels like a sort of slightly fictionalized autobiography. And you'll know exactly what I'm talking about, because there are lots of references to places and people from your past. But it feels like you've arrived at a crossroads and you're using the album to describe the crossroads you're at. And I think Realms of Gold literally lays that idea down of you being at a crossroads. Have you ever seen the film Electroglide in Blue? It finishes with, it's like this American film from the early 1970s. It was directed by the manager of, not Chicago, some American rock band. It was like this great folly. He was a manager of a band. He made this one film. It's beautifully directed. It finishes with a twist. And then he writes a piece of music that's 6 minutes long. And for that entire 6 minutes, all he does is he has a camera attached to the back of a van. There's a guy lying dead in the middle of the highway, a deserted highway in the middle of America, and he just drives really slowly away. So gradually the dead body gets smaller and smaller and smaller in the frame, while you get mountains and everything else coming into the frame.
Yeah.
And it's a really spectacularly odd but affecting way to end it, in a way that defines what the film is. Which is by way of saying, I think Realms of Gold works in exactly the same way as that, but as an introduction to your album. It lays the whole album out, while at the same time feeling like it's slightly apart from the rest of the...
dead body disappearing into the distance. Yeah, that's
not like a dead body disappearing into the distance. It's at the start. It's a living body coming into focus at the start of the record. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. Well, it's you know, it tells you, it gives you a... It's, you know, like I said, you know, I mean, I say most of what I want to say in the songs. You know, I mean, I'm really not hiding much. It's there. It's not fictionalized. Most of it is real people, real things. It's the first time I'd ever written like that. I just had to know whether or not I had it in me anymore. Is this what I wanted to do? Yes, it was, and I wanted to grow, and I wanted to explore my imagination, and I knew I had a gift for writing, but I wasn't sure whether or not I could survive anymore. You know, make a living out of it and do it. I had no idea, but it was exciting, and it felt alive. It felt very alive to go live. Yeah. Like we did. The other thing was, I'd gotten into this thing. I was really into like first takes. I took that seriously. That Van Morrison, hey kids, dig the first takes. You know, this kind of thing he's saying. I was into that because I wanted to try and capture these things before self-consciousness had kind of kicked in.
Yeah.
So that's really important to me. And in order to do that, I just had to make sure I took time to make sure these songs are really strong. These are not things that we're going to build on in the studio and make into productions. These have to survive now with just me playing them. And that was good for me.
Well, yeah, because you've got the version of Don't Let It Slip. Actually, you took out the band recorded version and replaced it with the radio version, right?
Yeah, just a quick radio version that we did in Tokyo. You know, you go into these radio stations, and they to advertise the gig and talk about the record, and they'll ask you to play one song, and I just did a quick one, and I liked it. I thought, well, that's better than the one that we did in the studio, and it was just on one microphone, but you know, that's the way it goes.
So the second track on Realms of Gold is The Coming of Grace, which I just think is an astonishing song, quite frankly. But what this does is it doesn't introduce, because it's there in Realms of Gold, but I think this one makes it a bit more obvious. There's a kind of religious theme to this. Is that something that you were sort of deliberately bringing into the music? Does that go with your sort of idea about making this more honest, I suppose? Is that something that was happening there?
Well, hang on. Let me just cast my mind back 30 years and see if I can remember. I think that first thing to say is that I'm not religious, in the sense is that I don't support any one team. I don't believe in monotheistic God, but I do think that I know that we have to have a spiritual life too, and to give life meaning.
Yeah,
and So again, I'm exploring very early days of me exploring what that means. and I still haven't got, but I just carried on exploring, and that was the beginning of that kind of search for me. I think, I was going through a big change. I mean, the 80s were me. I was fueled by ambition, and then and youth, and everything that came with it. And I had a great time, and I really enjoyed doing what I was doing. And then it all stops, it falls away, and you get some big questions appear in life about what's it all about, who are you, what was that about, what's this about, what has meaning, what's important. So all that stuff floods in. I was reading a lot of stuff, and I guess the Coming of Grace was a combination of that. I mean, I think it started off being called Dylan Thomas in Reverse, because the opening line was, because he has obviously rage against the dying of the light, and I wanted to invert that and say, well, I hope by the time that it is time for me to go to the next phase, that I accept that. And I knew that when I was very young, when I was at that stage, when I wrote that song, I was nowhere near that. I'm not much closer now, but I'm a little closer. I'm definitely closer in terms of years, but also in terms of acceptance. And so it was, it was a spiritual rather than religious influence.
And on the theme of influences, I think this is where you can start to feel the influence of Paul Weller a bit. Do you think what Paul Weller had been doing with his solo albums, and the fact that you'd been working with him on his solo albums and you'd been there in the studio for those processes, do you think that was starting to make itself felt here? Because I don't think Paul Weller sounds like a massive influence on what came afterwards, but you can hear his influence on this album, I think.
Well, he's on it. That's part of it. He's playing.
True.
But also, there was a. I think around this period, it was give and take. I think it was a two-way thing, because I definitely, and that was involving not just me and him, but my wife as well, Michelle, who was playing him things that I know that he really liked, like Neil Young and stuff like that he was coming around to. He didn't like Nick Drake at first, because he thought, I think, and then I put something on a tape. I was paying back because he showed me so much, so much of what Paul had been through in his life and stuff I'd listened to and I'd loved, and it opened my eyes to things, When I was a kid, learning to play guitar, the first time I discovered a major seventh chord was listening to, like, down in a tube station at midnight. What's that chord? That wasn't what punk bands played. Yeah. Which, and then you get into Ray Davis was another big. I was listening to. I hadn't really checked the Kinks properly, other than like the obvious tunes, and I was listening to that album Arthur, and that was. I still love that. It's my favourite Kinks album, and his writing style and things like that. So there was, but with Paul there was definitely an influence, give and take though, like I said, because I think Paul was a bit lost at the end of the Star Council, and there were things that I was doing that I think influenced him too. I think it was a two-way thing at that point, but it was never really spoken about between us. I just had some great moments, just sitting playing guitar with him, just sympathetically kind of strumming along with each other. It was lovely.
Yeah, sympathetic's a good word, because also synergy. There's a kind of a synergy between, I think there's a kind of synergy between where you are in your career and where he is in his. And he'd come to it by a longer and slightly different route, but you seem to have sort of landed at the same place at the same time. And I think this album, and Stanley Road, I guess, probably as well, is where you can hear that.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, because I'm playing on Stanley Road quite a lot of bass and bits of guitar, but yeah, he was very good to me. He was kind in the sense that, I did some. I really enjoyed doing some gigs with him when we were playing. Then I did some solo acoustic gigs. It was a buzz, playing the Albert Hall, going on my own, opening up in front of people. That's what the Albert Hall's for, because you just need an acoustic guitar and it sounds fantastic. And then I joined his band and played bass, and I couldn't hear a fucking thing because the drums are resonating around. I didn't know which. It was just because he's not built for rock. I mean, they've improved it now, and it was fun watching Paul go through what he went through, that climb back to where he really belonged, which was as a kind of icon of British youth. Paul occupies a similar space to someone like Springsteen does in America, for some, and it was fun watching that, being part of that for a while. Yeah. But then I move off because, you have to do your own thing. I was getting tagged too much as being an acolyte or too similar, and that wasn't the intention. That's not who I am, and I needed to get away from that a bit.
No, because I think there are similarities, but I also think there's something wholly different about what you are and the way you do things.
Well, we know that about each other. We know we're very different,
Sure, yeah.
So, but it's just lazy. It was lazy kind of assumption journalism at the time, I guess.
Yeah. Well, the next two tracks on Realms of Gold, and I think the switch around between what tracks are, the sequence of the tracks only occurs towards the end from the original Japanese version. But the next two, Comfort of the Clan, Follow Your Path, they're both very different from each other. They feel, I guess, if looked at from the outside, they feel like maybe the more slight part of the album because some of the sort of bigger hitters, the stronger tracks are around them. But actually, if this is as slight as the album gets, it's really not very slight. But what I think is happening with these two songs is that suddenly the album gets, and I hesitate to say this because it's not like it becomes fun, but it's slightly playful, if you know what I mean. I get the impression with Comfort of the Clan and with Follow Your Path that you're enjoying playing the music so much, if you see what I mean, enjoying playing the guitar so much that you're having a little fun yourself with the concept of how you write a song and with the concept of how you arrange the instruments and the music. So Comfort of the Clan is kind of, it could easily have been just a sort of verse, chorus song thing, but it goes off on these little diversions. Do you know what I mean? And there's sort of this feel to it that it's you taking the basics of what a song is and just saying, yeah, okay, that's what a song can be. But you stick a band in a studio who's sort of learning that. And what you say about sort of going into the studio and hearing the song in the morning and then sort of playing it in the afternoon as well sort of feeds into this idea of the song being a living, organic thing. And the versions of Comfort of the Clan and Follow Your Path that you've recorded here, they feel like you captured moments where you were just having fun with the band, playing these songs that actually the songs are really quite deep and quite affecting songs, but it sounds like you captured really interesting, playful versions of them.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, I took great care with the lyrics on this song. I knew that I wanted to get it right. Attention to detail on this one was important to me. Having come off the back of something like Springtime for the World, where there were lots of instrumentals and it was a very different beast. This I'd started, like I said, I've been through such big changes that I was writing about my emotions and from a personal perspective far more than I had done previously. So the words were strong. But conversely, I wanted to capture it before, at the very early stages.
Yeah.
In fact, I think I can't remember exactly, but they would be first or second takes. And you can hear the excitement of that in them. And that means me singing live with the drummer and the bass player. Might have overdubbed the keyboard or Paul's guitar. So basically they're built around live takes and they've got that kind of thrill and playfulness of somebody and a band of people playing something for the first or second time before you get a little bit sussed and a bit jaded and maybe a little bit, conditioned responses. So it's got that joy in it, and there were things, and the other thing was Karen Richards, the singer, had joined us at the end of the Blind Monkeys for Live, and she was a big part of that for me. Our voices, I really like the blend of our voices.
Yeah.
And she's got an unusual tone to her voice, and it was kind of worked with mine. So, I think that's what you're picking up on there. The playfulness comes from the fact that we're enjoying playing them because we've only just learned them.
Yeah, you can tell. And there's something else that happens on this album. And I listened through the entire thing in headphones again for the first time in a little while. Well, I say the first time I listened through it in headphones again yesterday by way of preparation for this. I listen to it all the time. And I think I noticed that I hadn't really picked up on before. In the Blow Monkeys, your voice is very young sounding, I guess. And since the Blow Monkeys got back together and the solo stuff that you've done since, your voice sounds a lot more mature. I think this is the album where you capture your voice at the actual point where it changes from one thing to the other. This is your voice changing from being the younger to the more mature. And because of that, it sounds a little bit more fragile at the same time as it sounds like it has a little bit more gravity. So it sounds a little bit more, not mature. What's the word I'm looking for? It just sounds a little bit deeper and more assured than it had done maybe on the Blow Monkeys stuff, but it's not as assured as it will become on the ones afterwards. It still has that kind of fragile quality.
Yeah.
Is that something that you can hear listening back to it now? Is it something that you noticed at the time that was changing?
You don't notice it yourself. You can't. No. I can't analyze my own stuff that much because then you start to flow. You know.
Yeah. You
know, years later, I can listen to it and I go, "Oh, my voice was still quite high then," because obviously I had to listen to it for this, and I hadn't listened to it for years. But it is different to the Blow Monkeys, and it captures a kind of a period of transition. Kind of growing up, I can hear, but not fully there yet, and that's good. That's what appeals to people, I think, sometimes, you know, about it. But there's you know, there are things on it that I wouldn't attempt to do or do now. I would sing it differently, but but you know,
again, like you say,
it's not self-conscious. You know, it wasn't done self-consciously. I can't analyze it in that way because I don't. It didn't happen that way. It just came out.
Yeah. There's something about your voice that's always felt a bit extemporized. The first time, because, you know, living where I live, which is miles away from anywhere, I don't get too much opportunity to go and see bands. And I never saw you in the early days. But one thing I picked up on with a couple of live videos that came out and a couple of live albums from those early days and the MTV concert that was put out and so on and so forth, is that every time you sing a song, you'll sing it differently. It's not a song for Robert Howard. It's not a fixed event. It's a fluid event that's constantly and forever changing. And your relationship with the song is forever changing. What's nice about this and what we're talking about here is that you're capturing moments here. But as you say, it feels like if you were to come back to these songs and record them again now, they'd be very different from what they were then.
Yeah, I believe that especially in live performance, they're living things. I mean, some people do that stuff where it's saying night after night. That's cool. That's showbiz, and I can't do showbiz. You know, I mean, you take it to the extreme example is Dylan, who I obviously adore, but you know, I've seen him at times, and you don't realise that he's playing "Blowing in the Wind" until he gets to the chorus because he's doing it in the kind of on the keyboards as a kind of samba, and he's flattened all there's no melody at all. It's just words punctuated with in almost rapping, and it's genius because for him that kept the song alive. That kept the thing real. You want to hear the original, you can go and put it on, or you might see a concert from 40 years ago where he did, you know, whatever. I think there's something really admirable in that. What it means, you're not shortchanging the audience. You're in the moment. Yeah. Right. And so if I'm singing "Digging Your Scene" again, I have to feel that I can have fun with it. I can play it a bit. I can do it. You know, of course it's the same song, but it has to feel alive.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And of course, anybody who goes to YouTube and looks at "Digging Your Scene" live will hear so many different variations on it. But anyway, we come to "Pond Life," which, in some ways, this is kind of one of the sort of really central points of this album. This is the point at which you sound the most angry. Do you? And is that what you felt at the time? It feels like this album, like I said before, is you at a crossroads. It's you looking at the past and maybe working out for yourself which bits of the past don't work or which bits of the past you don't want to take forwards. And Pond Life sounds like you shedding the bits of past, the bits of the past that you don't want to take forwards into your life going forwards. Is that fair to say? I mean, 30 years on or whatever it is, do you even remember what you were angry about?
I think there was a desire to break out of internalizing. I mean, I think Pond Life was based on that kind of that narcissistic kind of fable, and the need to get out and play to people and reconnect and to stop looking inwards. And like I said, there was a big change in my life. I was suddenly out in the countryside. There was no one around. The winter was dark and cold and long, and I wasn't used to. I lived in cities where even in the winter everything's lit up and there's people and there's multicultural kind of things going on everywhere in London, and I still love that about London. They go out to the countryside, especially the Shires, and I suddenly see Tory England, basically, and I suddenly thinking, shit, I didn't know this existed anymore, And but obviously I did, because they kept voting the fuckers in. But anyway, and then young kids, and I'm probably drinking too much. I'm getting agitated. I want to be out playing. I want to. Is it all over? I don't know. There's a lot of angst and anger and fear, but overall, that's how I express myself through music. So, there is. I don't know if it's anger as much as fear sometimes coming through. But the best way that I could deal with it, going through the changes that were unpleasant but necessary, was to sing about it. That's the only way I knew how.
Now, the sort of next song is Sanctuary, which I guess, if you think of this in terms of two sides of a vinyl album, would be the end of side one. And actually, the fun thing about this is it blends straight into the next song, which kind of it feels like almost a deliberate sort of production decision to make this feel like it couldn't possibly be two sides of a record, because you've done that. But Sanctuary, there is that version of it that you put out as a B-side from back in 91, and this version of it is very much pared back from that, although you've got the vibrato guitar on it, which kind of manages to maintain just a little bit of that feel from the original. Sanctuary, after Pond Life, you feel very angry. On Sanctuary, it sounds like somebody coming to terms with something.
Well, I think it's just that search. It's that search for some form of escape, some form of peace of mind, a desire to. I always, even when we moved out of London, Michelle and I had already thought that, we're gonna move abroad one day. We want to get into something else, another culture, for our kids to learn another language. It was always in my mind to do this. It took us a lot longer to get there. So this is just an expression of that. I think it's that kind of desire for escape. Although, of course, you never really do escape yourself. You bring yourself with you wherever you go. But so, and I think the reason I did it that way was to fit in with the rest of the album. The rest of the album was taking on the sound and the form. We did it all in one studio pretty quickly, so it had a sound. So the old version of Sanctuary wouldn't really have fitted in with that. The old version of Sanctuary that you're talking about was done really with Stardew's record. That I did that with Benny, and it was And on this Sanctuary, there's a guy called Brian Bethel playing bass. Yeah. Brian is my mentor. Brian was the first musician I ever met when I was a kid in Australia. And I went to his house once. I saw him first at the Sydney cricket ground, this guy with a spliff in his hand swearing on the hill. And he went back and he had a guitar. He had Fender guitar and an amp, and Dr. Feelgood's Down by the Jetty was at the top of his record collection. He was the first musician I'd ever met.
Right.
So
did you bring him over from Australia, or was it written in?
We left at the same time. We were going to form a band. We were going to come back. I was obviously a lot younger than him. I played bass, he played guitar, and I just watched him. That's how I learned to play guitar, really. He never stopped and showed me anything. He's not that sort of guy. But he's extremely funny, extremely witty, very clever. He came back, he joined 9 Below Zero and then The Truth. He was in those bands. And he didn't, but later on he played guitar with us live. But so Brian was another guy I got him along to when we were doing this album to play bass on a few things. But he's really my mentor as a musician, the first guy I'd ever met. And I thought, this world exists.
Yeah. Right, next up is Circular Key, which you put out as the first single in the UK, actually on a different label, because you switched labels in between Circular Key and the album itself.
Can't remember. I mean, I think probably we were Heavenly. Yeah, we were doing that. We were, like I said, I was hanging around with that Heavenly lot. Jeff Barrett is a really lovely guy. It was a good scene, the Heavenly Social. I think I might have even DJ'd a couple of times at the Heavenly Social. And he put that out as a 7-inch. The Circular Key obviously goes back to those very early days when I was busking in Sydney, when I first started playing the guitar.
Yeah.
And I realised that I couldn't remember people's songs, so I just started making them up. And that was the beginning. And the first time someone stops and pays you any attention and drops a coin into the guitar case, that was it. I was hooked. So from 15 onwards, that's what I wanted to do, So, but it was a hell of a place to busk, because Circular Key is the harbour in Sydney where the Sydney Opera House is and all that. So, it was quite wild, because I'd moved from a place called King's Lynn in the 70s.
Yeah.
That was the real black and white to colour moment in my life.
Well, and the record goes from colour to black and white, because right after Circular Key is Have No Roots, and there's a lot of King's Lynn in Have No Roots, I would imagine.
Yeah, I was thinking a lot about family, I was trying my kind of autobiographical songs for the first time, really. I hadn't really done that, although I had, but I hadn't noticed that I'd done that. Later.
Well, I've got to ask a question. Is this a concept album? And when I say a concept album, I don't mean in the sense of something, like something by Yes or whatever. But this is very definitely you doing autobiography pretty much across the whole thing, I think. So is this a concept album of you standing at those crossroads that I mentioned earlier? Is that the concept behind this album? Was it a conscious concept, or did it happen by accident?
I don't think it was a conscious concept. I think it's just me trying to write honestly about my emotions and what I'd been through in my life in order to find some connection, not because I thought I was special or that I had a particularly interesting story, because I don't think that. I don't think that it's not an ego trip. It's a means of expression in order to connect, because I think people relate when they hear something or somebody that's telling it for real.
Yeah,
I do. I find those kind of singer-songwriter things that I hadn't listened to before, like particularly Joni Mitchell that come to this, my wife, Neil Young, obviously Dylan, and Tim Hardin, Fred Neil in particular.
Sometimes
those people, it had really taken me to a place where I wanted to write something that could stand alongside with that in my head anyway.
Oh, that's absolutely. Sometimes it doesn't really matter what the lyrics are about, but as long as a listener you can hear that they mean something to the person who's singing them, and that comes through the voice. And as long as you can,
that's why I love Bolan. It doesn't matter that what the hell does Metal Guru mean. Well, what it is this joyous kind of explosion of sound. It doesn't have to mean anything sometimes. So there is that side too,
Speaking of bowling, one of my biggest memories I ever have of music is the first time I ever heard I Love to Boogie and those lyrics, and just sat there staring out the window thinking, what the hell just happened? But you never forget it.
Yeah.
Right. You mentioned sort of trying to find a real place. We talked about the autobiographical nature of this record. The next song, of course, is Ode to Bacchus. So I don't know how deep you want to go into this, and I don't know from the outside whether there is a story to go into or whether this is maybe a little bit fictionalized. But Ode to Bacchus is one of those songs. It just sounds like a really sweet love song. But obviously, it's a song about, well, alcoholism, I guess.
Yeah. Well, the alcoholism runs in my family. So,
right.
So I think that I was aware that I was using alcohol at this point to escape some of the kind of growing pains, if you like, you know.
Yeah.
I could see that in retrospect. But I was young enough to get away with it with my health. But I knew it. So obviously I knew it because I wrote this song about it. So the subconscious will act in funny ways and tells you the truth. It's still one of my favourite songs, actually, because I think I nailed it with the lyric and with the simplicity of the kind of melody.
It's got beautiful rhymes. Some of the imagery of the song is just amazing.
Yeah. So I think this is a successful song, and I'm sort of warning myself. I'm saying, watch out.
It's kind of a mind how you go moment.
Yeah, because I don't drink anymore. I haven't done for 10 years. I reached the point where it was definitely impacting on my health. I never was addictive in other senses, in terms of drugs and stuff, but alcohol was definitely a problem towards the end. And I thought, you go one or two ways. And that's why, in a sense, that over the last 10 years, been very productive, because it was getting in the way of that as well, getting in the way of my work and wanting to produce and stuff. So I think I knew this back then, that day would come, that I had to watch out for that.
Right, sure.
Well,
look, and let's go slightly out of sequence now.
Okay.
Oh, I'm getting another warning from Zoom. Love Zoom. Let's go slightly out of sequence, because we're talking about a song that's a warning, and in some ways, and this is the one that I think was added for the UK edition that hadn't been on the Japanese edition that had come out in 94. A Moment of Madness ends the album. Well, there's two things about that. One, it's about, I guess, maybe metaphorical violence, but violence in a relationship. But also, two, there's something about it, about the production of it. It sounds like you listen to, I don't know whether you ever have heard this, but I Am the Resurrection by the Stone Roses, which is a kind of a fairly sweet pop song for 4 minutes, and then just goes into a groove for another 4 minutes, and there's this like really long coda section. And A Moment of Madness plays this kind of sweet, but at the same time kind of violent pop song, and then goes into this really long, extended, quite swaggering sort of extended epilogue section, which is a bit, it feels a bit like you are saying to the Stone Roses, and like I say, I don't even know if you've heard their song. It feels like you're saying to the Stone Roses, look, you think you can do it? We're real musicians. We're actually doing it. And then even after that, it goes into this sort of post-epilogue bit where you've got the sort of, the little organ piece comes back in for 30 seconds. A bit like at the end of Follow Your Path, there's a bit where you've got fading up from another session from a song that you didn't use on the album. You've just got like the very end piece of another song from the album.
We were jamming, that's us jamming on Follow Your Dream, the Elvis Presley. I mean, one of the things we were doing in there was having fun. So we would quick jam while they got the sound together on a cover version or some silly song.
Right.
We'd all be laughing, and then I go, right, here we go, bang, and we're suddenly into like, because that's ooh, that's drama, and you get a good take that way. So that's what they were. That was kind of a little glimpse into how we were doing it. Moment of Madness has got that, this people misunderstood about me, I think, from the Blow Monkeys. I mean, there was always quite a lot of aggression in there. There's a little bit of anger in there. My father was a boxer in there.
Right.
I think you will find, although I was quite effeminate and stick thin with a long fringe and kind of fey, people thought, actually, I don't think people that knew me would say that. If you ask the band, there's a side. I'm saying it now because I'm always talking about myself in the third person, but there's a competitive, aggressive side that sometimes comes out in the music, and sometimes that's been counterproductive, but at other times that's been helpful because you need it. You need it to survive. It's a tough old business. It's a weird business, and what other business do people get to review your record in public and feel free to slag you off as much as they want to if they want to, but in the music press was brutal that way. So you had to be quite tough. You had to be mentally prepared to take that. And a lot of really good musicians I knew shied away from, didn't make music because they couldn't take that public humiliation of someone giving you a slag off in the press. I mean, it's not normal, is it, that you get judged in that way? So what I'm saying was that I did have this protective shell, I did have a bit of aggression, and I did have a competitive nature, but I didn't know that's Stone Roses' song. But there is a bit of that in me. Come on, we can fucking do this, man. Because sometimes you need that when you go out and play a gig. We did a lot of gigs early on in our lives where we were playing with bands that we shouldn't have been playing with because their audience weren't interested in us at all. And in the end, I quite liked those because I like the challenge of even getting them to respond in a negative way.
Right. But the lyrics on this,
spiky characters, man. I like spiky. I love Marky.
Right, yeah.
I love Marky Smith. I love the guy out of the Sleaford Mods. The fact they're not from Sleaford and they're not Mods, but he's great. Jason. I like Nick Cave. Bolan was a spiky character. I like those people, man. There's some honesty that's at play there. The unwillingness to play the game, the anti-showbiz stick. I think it probably was to the detriment of our success. I think we could have been much bigger had I gone along with all that.
Right.
But I just couldn't, not because it's just not in me. It's just not where I come from. So, I don't know if that makes sense. I mean, Moment of Madness is about, those crazy times when we get caught in Groundhog Day and we find ourselves arguing again with somebody and I've been here before and I can't seem to get out of this. But there's more to it than that, yeah.
It feels kind of brutally honest. It feels like you've made yourself one of those spiky characters. And it feels, in some ways, like a really strange way, lyrically, to end the album, even if musically it makes complete sense. But the way the album originally finished, in Japan, the first version of it that came out, as I understand it, was with So Slow the Rain.
Was it? I can't remember.
I think
so. So Slow the Rain is probably, that was the last track on the original, Which, again, that's another one I quite like, that I would, if I was doing a solo gig now, I would put it in because I enjoy playing it. Actually,
it's a really lovely song.
I actually like the riff. I think it. Yeah, tuning's wrong on this, but there was something about that I liked, and again, Brian Bethel's playing bass, and it's just about the frustration of standing there looking out the window, and here I am in this countryside, in this place that I don't really want to be in, and where is everybody and what's happened? And it's a bleak, rainy, cold winter's afternoon in the English countryside.
Yeah.
And then, of course, you get up the next morning and what a beautiful place. This is so lovely. It's all about your mind, isn't it? It's all in your head, really.
Well, you capture a moment of wishing you were somewhere else. And because of the honesty of the record, I think you really capture the moment of you feeling like you're wishing you want to be somewhere else. Do you know what strikes me about that record? When the bass guitar comes in, it sounds like they're trying to... It literally sounds like the song is trying to run away from where it is to be somewhere else. It almost physically makes that impression on you as a listener. It's sort of like deceptively not ordinary is not the word I want to use. It sounds like a deceptively normal song, but actually there's some undercurrent to it that kind of elevates it, I think. And yeah, you can sort of see why it would be the song that ends the album. The other one we've not really mentioned is Don't Let It Slip.
Yeah.
Which in the... Do you remember why you decided to go with the radio version rather than the full band version on the actual record that you put out in the end?
I think that I thought that I captured the essence of the song with that acoustic guitar version. I think it felt like I got it. And
there's a real immediacy.
On a technical point, I mean, there were different chords in it that I was playing on acoustic, and they seemed to go better with what I was trying to get to, which was really basically although I did love the original version because Marco played some super funky bass on it, as is his wont. He's great. and it had a kind of swing to it, but this just felt like, I captured it better. And again, it's one of those songs where I'm sort of telling myself, hold on to those loving feelings. Don't get too cynical. Don't get too down. Just remember what's important. Keep it simple. Yeah, I realised that a lot of what I had been doing in the 80s was really a cul-de-sac in terms of finding some sort of fulfillment. In other words, all the dreams that you have about success and getting a record deal and then getting on top of the pops and then getting they all happened to me. She's a one in a million.
So then the album came out in Japan a couple of years, 18 months, I think, before it came out in Britain. Certainly a year or so before it came out in Britain. Was this, you mentioned earlier on, the recording contract in Japan. Was that the reason why? Was it because you had this recording contract already?
They paid for it. They paid for the studio time, Pony Canyon.
Right.
And it came out there first, and then... in fact, I think I might have even recorded Bethesda as well, the next one with Pony Canyon.
Do you want to know something strange, which you might not have been aware of? Bethesda came out in Japan in between Circular Key and Realms of Gold coming out in the UK. It came out right between the single and the album. It was, according to the dates I've got, at least anyway.
You're probably right. I can't remember. It was all a bit murky, and I was about to sign to Heavenly, and then they got their funding pulled. There was all sorts of things. I'd done this album with EMI. That it was one of those, and then I went to Permanent Records, who ended up being not that permanent, but at least it was that they put out Realms of Gold, and it eventually came out in the UK. But I think it looked like to some people, oh yeah, he's doing a Weather, Wildwood and all that. But that's if I had been, it was 2 years earlier.
Can I ask, was there a time of particular excitement? Because this is your first album in the UK for 5 years. In fact, there's almost as much time has passed between Springtime for the World and this as had passed between Limping for a Generation and Springtime for the World. Did you feel the excitement of having a new record out, do you think?
I did, yeah, but the thing was that I hadn't stopped. I mean, we put the Starjuice record out. So and that, obviously that was a very limited edition thing, but I kept recording albums that didn't come out, basically. so it wasn't like,
by that time I'm thinking, fuck, is it going to come out? And then it did. And I remember initially, anyway, it got very well received. I think I remember some good reviews and stuff. A guy called Johnny Chandler, a good friend of mine who's now head at Universal, was managing me at the time. And I remember there was a good vibe around the record, when it came out.
Unless I'm mistaken.
Coming in Grace got quite a lot of play. Chris Evans played it a lot. It might have even scraped into the top 75 at some point like that. And so
I think Circular Key was like, unless I'm misremembering, was Circular Key not Single of the Week in the NME?
Yeah, it might have done. Yeah. So, I think it was... but, the landscape had changed an awful lot. I was an ex-80s pop star for some people. A sort of like that I had to overcome and fight against, put it this way, the perception that I indeed had helped engender about what we were.
Well, that's the big irony of this record. If this record had come out and it had been made by somebody who had no previous career, this could have been one of the shining lights of the sort of early days of that sort of Britpop movement. And although this is not Britpop, do you know what I mean? It's got that guitar band-based sound that would develop into Britpop. And there are some bands that were just sort of slightly askance of Britpop who sort of became fashionable because Britpop was enabling guitar bands to become fashionable in a way that they perhaps hadn't been since the 1960s. And this record should have been a part of that fashion. It should have been part of the early part of that fashion. But because you had this previous career, I think there was a snobbery about people.
Yeah, it didn't bother me. Some of the new gods of Britpop paid the dues. Noel played it. Noel Gallagher played it. Alan, who was drumming with me, we were in Japan and he got a phone call from Oasis to go and join them. And they just gone in at number one and sacked their drummer. And who was I to say, Alan, you stick with me, off he went. And that was great. And then so in a funny sort of way, I was sort of connected to that, and obviously with Paul and all that. But, I was playing the long game, really. I'm not, for me, it had become a process of just staying alive as a musician, finding a place where I could carry on doing that. It was quite hard because this is pre-internet or just very early days of internet. The internet opened it up a little bit more for me because obviously then you start to cultivate your own following again and your own thing. So there were moments where I thought, well, maybe this isn't, I'm not going to do this anymore. But then, my wife Michelle was really very helpful at that. She said to me, "Look, you never stop writing songs. You're always writing. Just put them out. It doesn't matter whether or not they sell a lot or whether they get into the charts or anybody even hears them. They're signposts that you've been working all along." And that's kind of what I started to see them as. Right. There was a period after Realms of Gold where Bethesda, Other Folk, Flatlands, which was particularly my favourite, because I really did go home for that one. I really did do that in my little bedroom on a little 8-track. And there were, although they were under the radar, it was really important for me at that point to be putting them out, to have some record of the fact that I never stopped working in a period where, especially during the 90s in Britpop, I wasn't really a part of the scene at all. I wasn't, you hang around long enough and things start to come back and they go, oh, 80s icon, yeah, I remember you. Oh, good, I like your new records, you're still making records. Oh, nice, yeah, and I've done 25 fuckers, mate. But, and it's, that comes later. But that kind of, that period after Realms of God, where I thought I'd made the best record that I'd ever made with Realms. In fact, I know I had. And I still think it's probably one of my top 5, if I'm being honest. And you like it, and it's best of all my records. So who am I to say? But I knew that it was good, but I knew that the timing wasn't right, and that it would be one of them that that percolates away, and that's how it happened. That's kind of what's happened to it. It's percolating. I'm a percolator. You know, I'm sort of permanently percolated.
Well, I was going to finish by asking, do you look back on it fondly? But you've kind of sort of answered that question already. I got a question to ask you. Do you still see Weller? Do you Weller still ever get together and do anything?
I saw Paul at a Stone Foundation gig a couple of years ago because they're mutual friends of ours. But we have at this point, it's been more of a WhatsApp relationship. But in fact, he got involved quite heavily in the new Monk's Road record, which we recorded at the end of last year at Rack Studios. And I got Paul singing on a tune that I wrote with Miles Copeland, not the Miles Copeland from The Police, but Miles Copeland, who runs Wonderful Sound Records. So it's the first co-write with Paul for, I think I don't think I've ever actually done that with Paul. So this will come out later in the year, September or so, called Rise Up Singing. So, but I've got a new one coming out on Monk's Road called I'll Keep On Searching, which is going to be the next single on there. So that Monk's Road thing's I've really enjoyed doing those.
Excellent. Yeah, we'll talk about one of those.
That's another story, but that's got me. That really got my juices going again. And again, saying a lot of the people that we're talking about have been involved in those, but with new people, mostly they're kids now. You know, they come in and they're fantastic. And so that's been real fun. That's really got my sort of spark back.
Excellent. Right. As for you and me.
Yeah.
If people have enjoyed this conversation and want to hear more,
and
I'm certainly up for asking you more, I'm going to make a suggestion now that if we should do this again, next time we go from this album, which was your first as a solo artist, and maybe we'll try and do it slightly more quickly next time rather than such a long and rambling conversation as we've had now. But this would be my suggestion for another conversation.
Okay.
The comeback record, because I think there must be a story around that that's worth telling. And we'll use that maybe as a tease to possibly in the future going back into talk about one of the original Blow Monkeys albums, maybe. But yeah, Devil's Tavern. I think there must be a story behind that. I would love to dig into it. And if you're up for doing this again, and if everybody wants us to do this again, I think that should be my suggestion for next time.
Okay, perfect. I'm up for it.
Brilliant. Excellent. Robert, thank you so much. I have really enjoyed this, digging into my favourite album, and I'm just sorry we didn't carry on for another 4 hours because I really could have talked about it all day, I think.
All right, JR, thanks. Enjoyed it.